Hello, welcome to the marvelous old world. My name is Matthew Smith. For today, I would like to revisit a slideshow that I presented on the Great Deception podcast some months ago, and there's a 3-hour version of this presentation that's more conversational with Matt over at the Great Deception. You can see it on my channel, Marvelous Old World, or you can go over to Matt's program and watch it there. Wanted to thank Matt for hosting me initially when I presented this, and it turned into a long conversation with each slide, and we hit almost 3 hours by the end of it. And what I wanted to do now is re-present it in a more condensed format, because I think that this information and this perspective is really needed these days as we move forward. More and more mainstream physics is coming to terms by fits and by starts with the quantum. Things that have been written about for thousands of years in sacred texts, modern sensibility is finally coming around to understand. So when we look at architecture, it's a very physical paradigm. It's in the realm of the real and the material. You look at a building and it's got physicality, but what we're focused on here is the energetic quality of buildings. And really, when you get down to it, and what science is realizing is that the more you zoom in on the microscope to matter, the less apparent the matter is. And so we're going to start out with a few quotes here to kind of emphasize this point. We have Albert Einstein, who did away with the ether in lieu of relativity, but he did comment that what we have called matter is energy, that there really is no matter. And from Nikola Tesla, who we would expect this perspective to come from, said light is nothing but a sound wave in the ether. Now, that quote right there gives me pause, because science thinks of light in terms of particle or wave duality. But when you bring the ether back into the equation, then we have a medium through which light can travel, or perhaps better put, that light is a perturbance of the ether. It's an agitation of the ether. So there is a medium. It's not a vacuum between particles, and that particles are emanating from one source and traveling across empty space to reach us. In fact, it's an agitation of the same ether that everything emanates from and exists within. And I got that from Ken Wheeler. You should look him up on YouTube if you get an opportunity to delve into these questions further. He says matter is hard light, and that really resonates with me as we look at the role of architecture in channeling energies. And then from Walter Russell, we have God is life, God is light, God is all that is. So sometimes it comes down to a matter of language. What we call light, perhaps we can also call God. We can call it prana. There's a lot of names for this. The word is the nameless. But as we proceed, we're going to look at how architecture is affected and in turn affects these questions. Now, we look at the 0 point of all creation, of electric creation. I emphasize the L because that is another name for God. And we have this duality between the magnetic and the dielectric. Sometimes we just, in sort of more lay terms, we refer to electromagnetism as being the framework of ethereal energy, right? You have, on the one hand, we have magnetism, on the other hand, we have electricity, more accurately, it's dielectric forces. And we'll get more into this too, that where you have magnetism, you have electricity, and where you have electricity, you have magnetism. And again, I just want to emphasize, if you're interested in diving into these questions further, I do refer you to Ken Wheeler's podcast on YouTube. When it comes to these issues, I'm a bit of a generalist and a bit of a layman. So, my focus is architecture, and I'm trying, as I communicate this, to comprehend it all on a deeper level as well. And I do believe that as above, so below, and as within, so without, these questions that pertain to the nature of reality also pertain to architecture. And specifically, I'm referring to sacred structures, as channeling these etheric forces. And I think it also applies to ourselves. We're charged with, above all and before all, knowing ourselves. And so I think these principles can be a guide for personal growth and development, raising one's own consciousness, and also when approaching the act of creation, whether it's a cathedral or a clay pot. I believe that all of these principles can apply as well. So on the one hand, we have magnetism, which holds a toroidal shape, right? The sacred donut. Sometimes they say it's the shape of creation itself turning inwards on itself. Scientists have also looked at electrons and admired, realized that electrons in fact are energetic toroids as well. We also have the idea of the anode on the side of the magnetic. It's represented by heat and illumination. And on the other side we have the dielectric, which is inertia. Okay? Returning back to stillness. And it's the hyperboloid. And when we talk about the hyperboloid, it's that glowing dot of nothingness in this image. But it's the hourglass figure where all things return to no thing. And that would also correspond with the cathode. So we have the anode and we have the cathode. And this is also cold and light. And light is distinct from illumination. But light, as I understand, is that agitation of the ether traveling from the point source to our field of perception, and the illumination is what we actually perceive. Now, plasma phenomena, and this is well known, is fully scalable from the infinitesimally large to the infinitesimally small, from the macrocosm to the microcosm. So a galaxy is going to have an electromagnetic or a dielectric magnetic toroidal field around it. And they even can perceive jets emanating from the center of galaxies, above it and below it, outward for countless light years. And they have a really hard time trying to explain that with the gravitational model that physics currently adheres to. But when we look at it electrically, we can see a mechanism at play here, where these jets are following the inward and outward breath, really, if we can put it that way, of a galaxy in motion. And we have the same thing with the sun, and as well as the planetary bodies, each having their own electromagnetic toroidal field. And we see this with vegetation, plant life, as above, so below. The tree will have an electromagnetic toroidal shape, and thus an apple that is growing on that tree will also have a measurable, discernible electromagnetic field. You pluck the apple from the tree, it's still a living entity until it's either goes back to the soil or is consumed. Now with humans, we aren't planted in the earth as such in the way that a tree is. So we need guidance. And I believe this is, at best, the role of the spiritual traditions trying to bring us, or give us a path, give us a way to connect with the divine, with that divine source, with that really electromagnetic field that we're part of, but we drift from. And I believe that this is the role of sacred structures. In addition to the teachings of a religion, when we talk about the sacred structures, they're performing a function to actually bring our spirit body, our energy body, into alignment with the earth and with the sun, with creation. And we can see this if you take a simple, just an iron rod, non-magnetized, and you place it against a magnetized iron rod, they're the same, exactly, precisely, in every way, measurable. They can be exactly the same, except that one is magnetized. Okay, its electromagnetic field is oriented to that of the earth. And here this is just a simple experiment that any child can conduct for no money at all, to see these principles in action. Where you have magnetism, you also have electricity, just by simply wrapping copper wire around a magnetized iron rod. In this case, it's a donut shape, and then connecting that to a light bulb, you're creating illumination. You're channeling the electrical charge that magnetism in that iron object produces. Okay? And this idea that a magnet is an inside-out AC generator. So that's very interesting to me, because, we think of producing electricity in terms of combustion. And so when we're burning fossil fuels, or petrochemicals, really, we're creating fire, we're creating combustion. And from that, we're creating rotation and motion, and from that we can generate electricity. But a magnet is doing this without combustion. And this is something that we really ought to be exploring much more in terms of channeling energy. Do we have free energy? Do we have a limitless source of energy all around us all of the time? And so it's my contention, and I'm not the only one. I'm, in fact, really just putting this together, these thoughts and these ideas together for myself, but there's many others who have said this before, and probably many who have said this a lot better than I am able to. But the idea that the ancients in the past who were building sacred structures actually understood this and built the sacred buildings in such a way as to channel these etheric forces. And not just, I should clarify, not just sacred structures. Many people in this research community have been looking at antiquitech and antennas and coming out of the tops of old world buildings and and raising this question about channeling etheric forces, creating a conduit between the atmosphere and the earth to where you can actually produce charge. Now, to take this a little bit further, this is steeped in the electric universe theory. This idea that, again, the ether is the matrix of creation, of existence, really, and that it has intrinsic, inherent electrical properties. And so they talk about Birkeland currents, named after the plasma physicist from well over 100 years ago. Christian Birkeland was able to actually reproduce these plasma patterns in a laboratory setting way back then. And so when they discovered that there's these filaments that are traveling throughout space, connecting stars, charging stars from without, providing another model for how our sun, for instance, receives its energy. Now we look at the sun as, or I should say modern science looks at the sun as a kind of like a combustion engine, like a nuclear furnace. And so that the energy from the sun that we receive is created by burning hydrogen atoms at its core in a nuclear process and kicking all that energy out to us. Well, that doesn't answer the question of why is it that the corona of the sun, which is way far away from the surface, is actually many, many times hotter than the surface of the sun. The surface of the sun, something like 6,000 degrees Celsius, whereas the corona is measured in millions of degrees. Now, how could that be if the heat is being produced from within the sun? But so if we look at this notion that stars are actually like pearls on a string, and the strings being these currents, these plasma currents that are traveling all through what we refer to as outer space, well, then we have a mechanism where we can understand that everything that is happening at the celestial level, planetary level, and the local, very human level is receiving its energy from an infinite source from without. Now there's experiments, simple experiments that, again, you can reproduce. What we have here is two magnets placed over what's known as a ferrocell, just a very thin, highly viscous fluid between two glass plates. And then when a light is shined through the side of these two glass plates, sandwiching this ferro fluid, and magnets are placed over it, they're producing these patterns that are recognizable all throughout nature, right? So this is, again, as Ken Wheeler has said time and again, the consummate geometry of reality. And we can see this reproduced too in the patterns created by running an electrical charge through copper coil. You have the iron filings producing this owl-like figure. And isn't it a wonder that this owl figure, this motif, has been carved into rocks all over the world? And so the idea is that petroglyphs are in fact not, just fanciful figure drawings, but actual recordings of what has been witnessed in the skies. Now, Walter Russell I believe, understood this on a profound level and has a lot to teach us about the nature of our reality. And one of the many profound gifts that he left us with was this recreation of the table of elements, where rather than the rectilinear graph that we're used to seeing, he places the elements in terms of octaves. So this raises important questions about transmutation. And if you start with hydrogen, I guess it's generally accepted that the sun transmutes hydrogen into all the elements that we know, but what is the mechanism with which it's doing this? And what Walter Russell's diagram here is suggesting is that it's all based upon frequency, and changing the frequency of an element can lead to transmutation, where essentially every element is reducible to hydrogen. But why is all of this so important? What does all of this have to do with architecture? Well, there's been a lot of studies lately that have come out about using different materials to store energy. Because with this new electrification of everything, really, electric cars, one of the biggest hurdles that they're up against is not so much the production of energy, but it's the storage of energy. So they're looking at using bricks, and here's this Scientific American article from 2020 talking about how bricks can be used as batteries on account of the iron oxide, right, which gives the bricks that reddish tint. And so here again, we have to ask the question, did those who came before us have on some level a fundamental grasp of this potential? And so then we look at the mortar between the bricks. Now, I'll do a deeper dive into this in a future podcast. I did discuss it again with Great Deception podcast. That podcast is available on this channel. It's a couple hour long conversation where we got into the nature of the original cement that was used in old world buildings in the United States, what is now the United States, really across in North America. Now, there's a book by this Uriah Cummings, 1898, where it's an exhaustive look at the nature of cement, past and present. And in the time that he's writing, the building industries had already shifted over to Portland cement. You can see on the right hand of the screen here the constituents of Portland cement. You know, we have calcium oxide, silicon dioxide, aluminum oxide, ferric oxide, sulfuric oxide, right? So it's a big mix of this and that, right? And why they like Portland cement was it has a fast setting time, but it also has a short lifespan. We've all probably driven across bridges that are no more than 50 years old that are cracked where the rebar is exposed and rotting. Well, you've probably heard that the aqueducts are still around after 2,000 years or more, because the Roman cement had special qualities to it. Well, lo and behold, American cement was like Roman cement. It's also known as natural or rock cement. And what that is basically dicalcium silicate. And that's it. It's the rocks out of the ground that they mine, where they find this dicalcium silicate, and that's pulverized. And when you think about what silicate is, it's quartz. It's basically quartz. And we know that when you put quartz under pressure, it has piezoelectric properties. That is to say, it produces charge under pressure. And when we look at the calcium side, well, I find that interesting because aren't our bones made up largely of calcium? So we have these two elements, one that makes up our bones and the other one that produces electricity, a crystal. And that's all there is in natural cement. Now, natural cement was found in buildings all over our land up until the late 1800s. And I posted this link here, and I'll put it in the notes below the video so you can look at the long list of hundreds of buildings in states all across the country, in regions that weren't even states yet. Basically, I think it's fair to say that the old world architecture in America all was built with natural cement. And why I find it fascinating, and it's a bit of a mystery, is that apparently the building industry simply forgot this. And so then when they went to do restoration work, for instance, on the bottom left of the screen is Fort Jefferson, off the coast of the Florida Keys, way out in the middle of the ocean, in the middle of nowhere, which is of questionable military value, but I'm not a military strategy expert. But they discovered in restoring this building, which is something like 16 million bricks in it, that the repairers were failing because they were using Portland cement, and they had, when you're repairing, let's say, tuck pointing mortar, you have to match like with like, or else the old material will reject the new material. And so in the 70s, when they were doing this work, they discovered they had a mystery on their hands, and they, to their great surprise, came to realize that what they were dealing with was a different type of cement. It was, in fact, this natural cement. I put this picture of what looks like a cave. This is in Rosendale, New York, in the Catskills, and I've visited here, and it's vast. And what it is a mine. It's a mine for this natural cement. And I have to say, when I went in here, I felt like I was in a place that was very ancient. It did not seem like a mine that was at best 150 years old or 200 years old at the very earliest. It felt like something that was very old. And the tools, it was funny because they were showing the tools of the trade and these wheelbarrows and these basically pickaxes, and they, at some point, they had invented a actual air-driven automatic hammer that they say was used to dig out this material. But I have to say, the ceilings were 25 and 30 feet high. This place is vast. And so when you consider that the old world buildings, and not just buildings, but bridges and canals, were all built with this earlier type of rock cement, only to then be replaced by that cement, only to be replaced by Portland cement from the late 1800s all the way up into the present time. And that somehow building industry has just simply forgot about this natural cement. It really begs the question, well, a lot of questions for me, starting with who really built these old world buildings in America. All right, we have the Iowa State House, and this is just a few, just to give you an example, a sampling of the type of architecture that was produced with this natural cement. The Iowa State Capitol is an awesome building. It's 5 domes. this marvels anything in Europe. And, we start getting into questions of how did a settler people who was busy farming and building their homestead, often before the railroad tracks were even completed and before industry was developed, how were all of these materials gathered to produce these just architectural marvels? We have this bridge in Minneapolis that, again, looks very old world, built with the natural cement. We have the State House in New York State, and again, Fort Jefferson in the Florida Keys, and this Allegheny Courthouse. Now, I'm going to do a future podcast focusing on what is known as, what we know as, referred to as Richardsonian Romanesque, this is a very fine example of. This is attributed to Henry Hobson Richardson, H.H. Richardson, who is said to be the first of three pillars of American architecture, along with Louis Sullivan and Frank Lloyd Wright. But there's a lot of questions about who this H.H. Richardson really was, and if he indeed was the architect responsible for these buildings. And I just throw that out there. Again, it's a subject matter for a future podcast, and the last thing I'll say about that is it's a bit like going after sacred cows of my own, because as an architect, Richardsonian Romanesque was absolutely my favorite style of architecture, and I really looked up to this figure. But now with the lens through which I am reevaluating the architecture of this land, and the who and the how and the when, I have more questions than answers when it comes to these buildings. And then on the right, bottom right, we have the Smithsonian Castle. And that too is going to be the subject of a future focus, because there's a lot of very strange history about this building and who is the architect. But we'll leave that for another day. Enough to say that all of these buildings and hundreds of others were built with this natural cement. Now, when we get into organizing the elements of a sacred building to actually produce a sacred structure, what is it that produces a sacred structure? Well, it is these elements. We've looked at how just the physical nature of different materials, we've barely scratched the surface, but how just the nature of the materials themselves can actually lend themselves to producing, very literally producing charge. But also the organization of the elements, how each element is placed in relationship to the whole and to the other elements. And we get into sacred geometry, right? And isn't it incredible that so many cathedrals actually pick up on the human form and the proportions of the human body? Now we know for sure that the human body is just replete with the golden ratio, with Fibonacci. Okay, and so no wonder that, again, that a sacred building would replicate these patterns. Well, I just love on the right, the Amiens Cathedral, and I hope I pronounced that right. It's perhaps just Ames. That's okay. Right, where we have the apse of the cathedral in the crown, in the head, right? The mind, where your pituitary gland would be. We have the choir at the throat chakra, right? We have the crossing at the heart, and that's where the altar would be. We have the nave at the belly, and we have the entrance where the human genitalia would be, where we enter into this sacred space. So I just find this to be very fascinating. I wanted to share that. I don't take credit for these diagrams. I wish I could give credit. It says DW. I pulled this off the internet, and I just thought it really communicated so much that I wanted to share it with this audience. And again, the way these buildings are proportioned is divine. And none of these are not construction drawings, these are studies, right? And so oftentimes I'm just searching for construction drawings because I'm as curious as anybody about how these buildings were built. But I'm always looking for construction drawings. People often talk about, these researchers in this area often talk about construction photos, and there's a lot of questions about the integrity of a lot of construction photographs of old buildings, but construction drawings, it's often, there's a kind of sense that the builder, the master builder, was just kind of figuring it out as he went along. And I just reject that. I dismiss that entirely. That this was some kind of, building of cathedrals, some kind of ad hoc process. There's even a book about it, a novel by Ken Follett called It'll Come to Me, Pillars of the Earth, where he writes a whole novel after he says he studied this question for 20 years and what it actually took to build a cathedral. And he visited many cathedrals in Europe, and then he finally came out with this novel telling the story of the construction of a cathedral, and it was really just, I don't know, like silly. It was good writing, it was, good storytelling, but as far as what it actually took to put together a cathedral building, again, it just had this sense of, well, it was ad hoc, and they figured it out as they went, and cracks started forming in the arches, and so they decided to add flying buttresses, and all of this it's goofy, because to build a building such as a cathedral requires advanced planning. Any building, even a small house, needs to be engineered if it's even to receive a building permit these days. Some states don't require this, most do. But most every structure that's built has an engineer behind it, and they're going to tell you how big the beams need to be, how much rebar is going to go on the footing, and it's the architect that produces the design, and an architect that has a good sense of engineering and a good sense of building methods can apply all of that into a very elegant but also very buildable building. But it's the engineering that's going to make sure that structure can withstand the forces that nature is going to throw against it. Now with a cathedral, you're not going to leave things to chances. There's going to be advanced engineering that goes into that very advanced architecture to produce an edifice that is going to last for 800 or 1,000 years. And on the right, this is the best I could come up with in terms of construction drawings. And it's really just more of a mystery than anything. And it tells me that, a sacred consciousness went into the conception, just the very conception of a cathedral. And here we have embedded in this artwork is the Hermetic principles. And it's from a wonderful book that I picked up along the way called Natural Architecture. It's the most I ever spent on a book. I think it was like $350 or something, but I thought it was worth having to pursue, and maybe I'll pursue these questions, and maybe I will do a deeper dive podcast into just that book in the future. Now, when we take the interior of cathedrals, and all of the things that we discussed and looked at so far, and carry those forward into the actual interior space, the first thing that comes to my mind is a crystal. That these are enormous crystalline structures, again built out of materials that have an electromagnetic quality to them around sacred geometries in crystalline fractal patterns, self-similar replication where every element reflects the whole, like Indra's web. And you can imagine how such a structure can hold vibration, can hold energy, can hold resonance. You can imagine a choir singing in such a space, and how this structure, just by its very nature, will not just hold that, but actually amplify that sound energy. And here we return to this idea of fractals in nature, throughout nature, whether it's electrical arcing, Lichtenberg figures, the formation of crystals, the growth of plant life, the way water freezes into crystals, the way canyons are formed, all based upon self-similar fractal replication. And now we go to the outside of cathedrals. We see stone and metallic spires and fractal antennas. Now, what's a fractal antenna? And again, we return to the idea that if it's true, and I'm 100% convinced it is true, that our reality is emanating from the ether, well, a spider knows to climb up on a blade of grass to catch an electromagnetic current. Baby spider, this is how they drift off. It's not on wind or breezes. They've done experiments about this to show that they're not catching breezes, so they may be, but that's not what's lifting them off a blade of grass. What it is electromagnetic current, because you have the blade of grass is coming out of the earth, holding that negative charge, and it's climbing up as high as it can into the positively charged atmosphere, and it's drifting away. Well, aren't these structures doing the same thing in their fractal nature? Now, any antenna, a TV antenna, will have a fractal quality to it, a fractal shape, and they've shown again and again that the best antennas are these self-similar fractal patterns. Why not the same with stone? And here on the image on top, we have that very thing. This is the first Russian satellite, a stamp commemorating the first Russian satellite from the 1950s, where you have fractal antenna communicating with the satellite. And on the top right, well, we don't know what this is. We can scratch our head and surmise, but we often see these, again, what look like fractal antenna in these old world photos and postcards. Oftentimes you'll see these photoshopped out of old photographs, which is curious in itself. Why would they want to disappear this information? Well, perhaps for the same reason that Tesla died a very lonely and broken man, because what he had to share with us, that electricity can be generated simply by connecting heaven and earth, and that it can be transmitted for free over great distances without wires. Well, the modern industrialists of this age, who begat this age, did not want that technology and that information to be widely disseminated. But time and again, we come up against this realization that in fact they understood it well. We have the world fairs, the photo in the bottom center, right? That says Edison light. There's the current wars between, there's a fun movie about Edison versus Tesla, AC versus DC. Well, that's all. How were they going to, what was the best system, alternating current or direct current, to run through the wires? But again, Tesla was running parallel experiments demonstrating to Westinghouse that wires were not needed at all. And on the right, there's a lot of these types of images that I've seen, and who knows how many hundreds of years old these are, but that on the top of these obelisk-like towers, there was what appears to be atmospheric charge being produced in the form of illumination. And then we get into the rose windows in these cathedrals. And aren't these just like cymatic patterns? The type we'll see all throughout nature, in snowflakes, in water patterns created with different frequencies played through speakers and then photographed through in star forts. We see these cymatic patterns produced again and again. And isn't it a wonder that the rose windows in these cathedrals would actually look like or be modeled after cymatic fractal patterns? Now we get into the sacred geometry, the flower of life being the foundation of sacred geometry. Again, following natural order. I know that this is a little hard to see on this screen, but if you're interested, this can be found easily. But what this represents is that everything starts with the void. Everything starts with a point. Measuring equidistance around any point, which is to say around any no thing, any center, well, then you arrive at a circle. And if you intersect two circles at their centers, two equally sized circles at their center, then you're ending up with the Vesica Pisces. And that pattern is shown again and again, replicated in sculptures in cathedrals and pattern books and old paintings. We see the Vesica Pisces, and the Vesica Pisces holds within it the ratios, the golden ratios, the Fibonacci sequence. And then we go on from there, and we arrive at the seed of life and the flower of life. And then eventually connecting dots of the fruit of life, which is on the left side. Platonic solids start to emerge from Metatron's cube. Isn't it fascinating? We have the tetrahedron, the dodecahedron. These are even too small for me to read. I haven't memorized them all, but yeah, you get the idea. And the beautiful thing about the Platonic solids is that if you can put each one of them into a sphere, and the vertices will all touch the edge of the sphere, so they have that special quality in common. But that three-dimensional life, and this is the message that I want to convey here, three-dimensional sacred shapes all start from a point. And then within nature, the infinite variety of nature all derives from these same principles. An infinite combination. And you wonder if there's a divine hand behind all of this. Now, another element of cathedrals is the pipe organ. These are marvels of instrumentation. They send sonic vibration throughout cathedrals, again with the rose windows acting as amplifiers. And can you imagine some of these exquisite instruments having upwards of 40,000 intonations, some of which are inaudible to the human ear? Now, why would that be? Why would you go through the trouble of building pipe organ that produces vibrations that we cannot even hear if it didn't have some other function, if it wasn't for some other purpose? And again, I would contend that the purpose was to affect change within the human spirit. We would call it aligning chakras. We just call it aligning the spirit body, the energy body, and connecting us again back to divine source. And you take these pipe organs and you put that together with the crystalline structure and the piezoelectric nature of the materials themselves, the sacred geometry, and you project all of that through your cymatic rose window, and now you're going to project all of that healing energy, that vibration, into the neighborhood surrounding the cathedral. And here's our cymatic patterns. On the left, this is cymatic patterns produced by planets. And we have cymatic patterns, again, produced in water with different piano notes. And we have DNA itself reflecting cymatic patterns. And then on the floors of the cathedrals, because they leave no stone unturned, uncovered, every aspect of these structures is considered. Every detail, again, is reflecting the whole. And we have these clues left for us in the form of these labyrinthian patterns in the tile work and the floors of these cathedrals. And each one of these patterns is in a different cathedral throughout France and England and Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Germany. And interestingly, some of the more rectilinear ones look to me like I work with ayahuasca, plant medicine, and the Shipibo make these beautiful, they call them telas, these beautiful patterns that they weave into cloth fabric, and they look a lot like what I'm seeing here in these more rectilinear vibrational patterns. I mentioned star forts, and a lot of folks have delved deeply into the question of star forts and the mystery surrounding them. And I can't help but conclude after my own investigative research that these sure may have had a military or a defensive function, as well as a highly energetic one. Because the work that would have gone into creating these really what look like fractal cymatic patterns, it's mind-boggling. And to produce this in an era before lasers, before GPS, satellite, before even electrical transits, before power tools, to be able to lay this out is mind-boggling. And so you really would have had to have had a pretty good reason to do it. And again, the argument that these were just for for military purposes, it doesn't pass the smell test. So I think that what we are looking at are crystalline cityscapes, highly charged, energetic, nodal points, really. And then when you look at the fact that almost all of the cities throughout Europe started out as star forts and star cities, it really makes you pause and wonder about the nature of this realm and where we come from. And I wanted to conclude with a look at a city that was based on these principles. Right? When you bring all of these principles that I discussed into the creation of a whole city, where you have a cathedral at the center of things, and you have a star pattern that's producing the layout of the cityscape itself, with the in-between spaces filled with gardens, and you have transportation nodes with buildings that look like they could be or are sacred structures themselves. This marvelous architecture with this antiquitech, these etheric antennas all over the place. And you have bell towers, and you've probably seen the photographs of the Nazis rounding up the bells, right? They're the enemy of the bells. Now, why would that be? What sort of energy transfer were they trying to put the kibosh on? Now, these photos here, this set of 4 postcards, they're of Dresden, and I put this up here as a reminder of what we had. And of course, Dresden was absolutely destroyed by the United States military during World War II. There's a lot of questions as to the military purpose of that. And the more I've looked into this question, the more I've come up against the troubling realization that these great powers were focusing on destroying each other's heritage centers, bombing each other's sacred spaces, sacred structures. And that leaves us with a lot of questions, always more questions than answers, about what the nature of war is. But it's enough to put the emphasis on the fact that not too long ago, our realm was a very, very special place. And that the built environment, while it may not have been run with wires and combustion engines producing electricity and meters on the other end of those wires monitoring and controlling how much that energy you're allocated, allowed to use, right? It's a scarcity model. But what we see here is a different approach to channeling energy. So when we ask the question, is there such a thing as free energy? I think that we need to maybe zoom out a little bit and ask the question of what is energy, and when looked at through a different lens, how can energy be channeled? If the Earth is an electromagnetic battery, as all planets seem to be, then by aligning our built environment with those forces seems to indicate that we ought to be able to channel them. And the more we look at it, it seems to indicate that's precisely what our ancestors were doing.